The electricity grid is a classic example of a highly nonlinear chaotic system. Small changes in one part of the grid could amplify into complete collapse on a moment's notice if operators aren't careful and have not invested in sufficient redundancy, for example.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and these are the Miles Franklin Weekly Specials for December 25th, 2023 through January 1st, 2024, while supplies last. First, we feature 1 10th-ounce gold maples at just $30 over melt with a minimum order of 5. Next, we have silver eagles at $4.99 over spot, making this a great time to swap silver bars into silver eagles at the lowest premium in years. Finally, constitutional 90% silver is just $3 over spot per ounce. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.
Hey everyone, this is Elijah K. Johnson with Liberty and Finance. And back with us today is our good friend Doomberg from the very popular Doomberg Substack, the #1 financial contributor, paid financial contributor on Substack. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Elijah K. Johnson, Happy New Year to you and to your family. And I hope you all had a wonderful Christmas break and are getting ready to get back at it here in 2024.
Yeah, well, Happy New Year and Merry Christmas to you as well. Hope you had a great holidays there. I did want to ask you about 2024 as we embark on this new year. A couple of your recent articles were very enlightening. When it comes to kind of grid vulnerability, I know your Substack focuses a lot on energy, and our channel focuses a lot on preparedness. And it's important to consider the vulnerabilities out there. And a lot of people don't consider energy when they are considering, preparedness. So what are some of the vulnerabilities that a lot of people, even in the mainstream, aren't looking at right now?
Yeah, as you mentioned, we published an article on the 2nd of January, our first piece of the year, called Inverted Priorities, where we talked about an accumulating risk to the major grids in North America that has been growing as renewables make their way into a larger and larger share of our production capacity. And it comes down to a fundamental difference between how traditional generators of electricity, go about their business versus intermittent renewables like wind and solar. When you are spinning a large turbine at a gas-fired power plant, for example, that turbine is rotating. It's a heavy mass rotating quite fast. And that generates inertia, which is sort of a concept of physics. A body in motion tends to want to remain in motion. That inertia allows traditional power plants to ride out transients in the grid, little fluctuations in voltage or frequency that happen whenever a short happens or a fault happens somewhere, in this interconnected grid. And we should say at the top, of course, the electricity grid is a classic example of a highly nonlinear chaotic system. Small changes in one part of the grid could amplify into complete collapse on a moment's notice if operators aren't careful and have not invested in sufficient redundancy, for example. The challenge with wind and solar, which the power industry refers to as quote unquote inverter-based resources, is that they produce direct current, and they must be passed through inverters before they're fed onto the grid. And these inverter-based resources have no inertia. They don't have large spinning parts that can ride out these little bumps. And so oftentimes, during events that can be easily handled by traditional power plants, in order to protect themselves, these renewable energy facilities take themselves offline proactively. And that can lead to a cascading series of such departures from the grid, which then can leak its way back into traditional power plants when their inertial insurance is overwhelmed, so to speak. And we've seen several dozen near misses cataloged by North American Electrical Reliability Corporation. Two of them in the Odessa region in Texas were the subject of the examples that we pulled into our piece. But below the radar, operators of our national grids are beginning to sound the alarm. And it looks like the cost to abate this risk certainly wasn't contemplated when we set about the journey of the greenification of our grid with, the word greenification in quotations. But ultimately, either directly or indirectly, we're all going to have to bear it.
It is staggering the vulnerability out there, as you mentioned, and how there's not a lot of redundancy in the system. Could you kind of expand on how this could really impact the average person in the US? And what are some of the steps that people should take? If the government or the energy producers out there aren't going to take the steps to secure the system to prevent these kinds of outages, how can people take prudent steps today, maybe getting a backup generator or something like that, to protect themselves and their families?
Yeah, two parts to that question. The first part is, how big of a deal is it, I suppose? A grid is incredibly valuable. It is the foundation of a prosperous society. We have come to so rely on the grid that even the loss of electricity for a period of several days, for example, could throw our major cities into extreme chaos. And especially, say, if it happened in the winter in New York. The large power outage that we referred to in the piece luckily happened in the summer and only lasted something like 24 hours. If we have a 3, 4, 5-day complete shutdown of the grid in a major U.S. city during the dead of winter, it could be pretty catastrophic. As it pertains to what your listeners and viewers can do, as we have discussed on prior appearances, I firmly believe that preparedness starts at home. And you should ponder what would happen to your specific dwelling if you lost power for a period of 1, 3, 5, and 10 days. I think those are all reasonable scenarios to plan against. The biggest challenge, again, is if you find yourself in the northern part of the country and temperatures don't rise above 32 Fahrenheit, and you're faced with the prospect of water freezing in your pipes in your home and things like that. That can be pretty challenging to heat a large dwelling in the absence of ready access to electricity to power your furnace, for example, assuming you have a furnace. There are things you can do. So, for example, I personally have a natural gas powered whole house backup generator. Not everybody can afford that. But if you can afford it and you haven't pondered doing it, in our view, this is kind of like paying insurance on a house. I hope it never comes on. I hope I never need to use it. When the calendar turns and my house hasn't burned down, I don't begrudge the insurance I paid in the prior year. I'm happy that my house didn't burn down. For those with a bit more economic limitations, then you've mentioned a standby generator. I would say if you're going to go down that route, you should operate it. You should run things off it as a practice. We like to say that preps don't become preps until they're used for their intended purpose. And until such circumstances, they are just stuff. They're just things that sit in your garage. And so you should be routinely running your fridge off a generator and see how hard it is and see how loud it is and see how much fuel it consumes and see how often you have to change the oil and those types of things. Because when the emergency does happen, you don't want to be caught flat-footed. Missing oil, for example, or not having any gasoline or propane is my preferred way to power backup generators. And then the last thing I would say is I personally own several what are known as solar batteries. These are giant, usually lithium-ion batteries that come with solar panels that you could recharge those batteries during the day. And those are actually pretty good for example, powering a fridge overnight quietly and then just recharging them during the day, either using the solar panel or your gas power generator while it's powering other things when it's okay to make a loud noise in your neighborhood, for example. So there's a whole rabbit hole you could go down, and depending on your resources and your fear or your paranoia on the topic, you can spend a lot of money. But ultimately, the quickest, easiest, best way for all of us to prepare is to advocate for a sounder grid and to point out these risks, which we try to do in our piece.
No, to be clear, I know that when you started Doomberg, we were seeing kind of an energy shortage in different areas. But you've made the point recently that we've seen an energy abundance, actually. So this has nothing to do with the amount of resources out there. It has to do more of kind of just a lack of preparedness on a national level that the U.S. has, the situation that the U.S. has put itself in of distributing that energy. It has nothing really to do with the supply of energy itself, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure we'll talk about the call we've been making on energy abundance here in a bit. But we have embarked upon a massive public works project of completely altering the means by which we transform primary energy into electricity. And it is our view, and the view of many in the industry. By the way, the idea for this piece was a result of conversations we had with concerned people in the industry who reached out to us to say, like, nobody's talking about this. This is under the radar. You have a platform. This might be interesting to you. And as we've grown and we've our subscriber base comes from industry in a lot of cases, we've been benefited from what we're calling the network effect, where we have an enormous number of expertise willing to provide us with good leads, and then the same number of experts that we can bounce our conclusions off to make sure that they're on point and so on. And so our pieces get better and our topics get more interesting over time. But to the question, yeah, we have massively altered the way we produce electricity. We have forced the introduction of relatively unproven technologies into a grid that has a whole suite of pre-existing plants that need to then make accommodations for intermittent and less robust power sources that the government is mandating that we include. And so, a grid with a lot of inertia is said to be robust, and a grid with minimal inertia is said to be susceptible. And at some points in Texas, for example, 2/3 of the electricity is being generated by such sources. And it doesn't take much of a blip, as we demonstrated in the piece, to create a cascading series of failures. And it's only a matter of time before an entire grid goes down. And by the way, we didn't even get into it in that piece, and it's only because it's almost too scary to contemplate. But we've heard rumblings from industry insiders that the so-called black starting of a grid is significantly challenging. What does that mean? That means when a grid goes down completely, getting it back up can be a challenge. And we've heard rumblings that some of the simulations being done at the national level for such an event were pretty scary. Now, not having anything tangible to reference, it's difficult for us to include that in a piece. But for those with a bit of a preparedness mindset, that should give you a little more motivation to set about the task of completing the procurement of a generator, or maybe getting a quote on that whole house generator, or investigating, solar batteries and so on.
Now, there has been talk about cyber attacks possibly, and as we see geopolitical conflicts escalate around the world, it seems like, we're making enemies a lot of places we go. Do you see any risk in that regard? Could any sort of cyber attack or a attack from another country impact the grid here in the U.S.?
Yes, absolutely. That's always been a risk, but at the same time, I would say a major attack on the U.S. grid would be considered an act of war, of course. And we suspect that at least the nation states who might have the capabilities to perform such a thing might be hesitant to do so. Now, of course, that does not rule out terrorist actors or non-nation state actors from doing that, or just pick your favorite anti-Western sect in the world. But that has always been a risk, and one that you really can't do much to prepare against. And in our view, for example, I do not have a wood stove in my home, and so it's difficult to contemplate getting through more than a couple of weeks in the winter staying in that residence. And so while I have shaven off, say, 95% of the scenarios, there's a tail risk that I think is just impossible to prepare for. And that's why it is best to proactively defend against it by stiffening our defenses against cybersecurity attacks, or increasing the robustness of our grid while we still have time.
Now, one of your recent articles was talking about a Western alliance of based on energy. And I know that this would be very helpful to remove our dependency, right, on some nations, for example, like Saudi Arabia in the Middle East. Your perspective on that, what sort of alliance could we build so that we don't have so much dependency on other countries?
Yeah, to be fully transparent, that piece was more of a daydreaming exercise than a proposal or an expectation that anything even remotely close to what we had imagined could be possible would ever come to pass. The piece was called The New World's Oil, and the social preview for that piece was, when it comes to energy, a united Western Hemisphere could neutralize the Middle East. And the numbers are staggering. It might surprise some of your viewers to learn that the Western Hemisphere already outproduces the Middle East in our preferred definition of oil, which is crude plus total petroleum products. And we've barely scratched the surface of what's available in Latin America for a variety of reasons, many of them own goals on our part, as we described in the piece. But there's an enormous amount of hydrocarbons available in Latin America, and if only the discovery of such things, would be beneficial. We closed that article, doing our best John Lennon interpretation, I guess, but we said, imagine a world where technology perfected in the oil sands of Canada is leveraged by Venezuela, where the dispute over Guyana's resources is resolved peacefully, where the technical wizardry of the U.S. shale operators is deployed to help rescue, Argentina from its economic tailspin, and where Mexico's failing oil and gas sector is revitalized, and where Brazil doesn't want to join OPEC, but they'd rather cut a deal with their neighbors. And what a world that would be. A world where the discovery of oil is enriching and not ruinous. But alas, we don't live in that world. And as we say, tragically, 2 centuries on from the time of Monroe, which was the opening story for the piece, which was the conception of the Monroe Doctrine 200 years ago. Imagination, unfortunately, seems to be in chronically short supply, at least amongst our diplomatic corps.
Definitely. Now, if we can move on now from energy and move towards the economy, I did want to discuss the economy in 2024 and your perspective, because a lot of people have been looking for a recession recently, and it hasn't happened. Are you concerned at all about the U.S. economy in 2024, and what is your outlook?
It's funny because we did not discuss this before my appearance today, but tomorrow morning, which is probably around when you'll publish this podcast, we're publishing our next piece called Slick Landing, where we're making the case that the Biden administration's admittedly cynical use of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, combined with the massive production of hydrocarbons in the U.S. that we've seen in the past 2 years, are why we have not yet slipped into a recession. And we believe that the odds of a recession anytime soon are diminishing rapidly. If the lack of energy causes economies like Germany to deindustrialize, we have never produced more oil, never produced more natural gas, still produce more coal than we need, still have 60 operating nuclear power plants. Natural gas is as cheap as it could be. Natural gas liquids are exploding. The Permian Basin keeps growing, defying all expectations of the naysayers. If a shortage of hydrocarbons and energy crushes an economy, then surely an abundance of it is bullish. And then when you mix in the fiscal recklessness, i.e., we just turned in another $1.7 trillion deficit in 2023, in the fiscal year 2023. As much as that is boring from the future, you cannot ignore the sugar high that it's going to produce today. And so on top of that, you have the Fed, which seems to be getting more political by the month, standing by, ready to cut rates into the election. That's a pretty interesting brew. You have a manufacturing-heavy economy like the U.S., sitting on the world's largest supply of cheap hydrocarbons at a time when the Fed is looking to cut rates and the government is spending money hand over fist. That does not scream to me like a scenario where a recession would spontaneously appear. In fact, the labor numbers, the jobs report from this morning, beat expectations, and the unemployment rate ticked down to, I believe, 3.7%. I mean, where on the board is the recession? And look, credit where credit is due. Our good friend Tony Greer has been on this for many months. And has been trading it accordingly. But when we go back and look at the energy production data of the U.S., we like to say every macro analysis should start with whether the economy you're analyzing is currently in a state of energy excess or energy deficit. The U.S. is undeniably approaching glut levels. We have more natural gas than we know what to do with. Natural gas is a very valuable molecule. It is at the beating heart of every heavy industry in the country. It is as important to industry as gasoline prices are to the consumer. And right now, natural gas is trading for the equivalent of $20 in oil, $20 a barrel oil. Like, this has to be recognized. And I believe, we believe, and we're putting it out, making a call, that the fossil fuel industry saved the U.S. economy from a recession.
It seems like as you mentioned, there are a lot of issues with respect to debt. But when it comes to the economy, you mentioned really how cheap energy could be saving the economy right now. So how do those two issues play together? Because a lot of our guests are concerned about, the ballooning national debt and saying that that spells disaster for the financial system in the future. So how do you reconcile those two seemingly competing factors there?
The simple answer is it comes down to time frame. So our narrow question is, why haven't we had a recession since the two consecutive quarters of relatively small contractions that we saw in 2022? And will we have one ahead of the elections? Do we think that it is sound policy to run trillion-dollar deficits as far as the eye can see? Of course not. Do we think this is sustainable? Of course not. Do we think that will trigger a recession in the near term? Quite the opposite. Government largesse is the private sector's benefit. And cheap energy plus government largesse plus very low unemployment plus a Fed willing to accommodate largely for political purposes is a recipe for extend and pretend, at least for a few more quarters.
Moving forward then in 2024, based on that we could see a booming economy, we could see lower energy prices. What then is your forecast for both if we look at the general stock market, a lot of people are looking for possibly a melt up coming soon, which is contrary to what we saw in 2022, or we saw this, it seemed like a lot of people were saying at the beginning of a crash, right? But some people are now looking for a melt up in the stock market. What do you say to people, in traditional investments right now? Do you think 2024 is going to be good for them, or would you consider alternatives?
Yeah, hard for me to say, since I'm not a trader, the direction of the stock market over any reasonable time period. I would say that we are bullish gold in this environment. I do think that the development of a physical exchange window in Shanghai is having a big impact on the gold market. We are long gold, both physical and through the Sprott gold paper offering. But as far as like the stock market goes, look, anything can happen. We're seeing the potential for a war in the Middle East. And if war breaks out between the U.S. and Iran, then oil prices could easily go back above $100 a barrel. I mean, those are very difficult to model. We're seeing, blockades in the Red Sea and missiles being fired at container ships and a drought in the Suez Canal, and that could all lead to a situation where we have an inflationary pulse and commodities spike once again. And so, but our call is more, all things being equal, we would be relatively concerned if we were overexposed to commodities. We would look to take some risk off the table there. We are always hesitant to buy stocks given the valuations that exist in the market. Doesn't mean they can't go up. It doesn't mean they can't melt up, as you say. But our preference, as you know, is to invest privately where we can directly impact the outcome. And we've had good success in that regard. So the only thing I would say that we've sort of altered is we've allocated a bit more of our liquidity towards gold, which is predominantly a savings vehicle for us. But we do think 2024 is going to be an important year for that precious metal.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you on Doomberg to get your unique perspective on energy and also the economy. If our viewers are interested in learning more, they can go to doomberg.substack.com. Can you tell us a bit about your work there?
You bet. We publish 6 to 8 articles a month. We also have a pro tier where we do at least one in-depth presentation per month called Doom Zooms, which are always fun. And also we have all of our podcasts linked there, at least the ones that we get the links for. And our Substack is categorized. So if you scroll down, once you land on doomberg.substack.com, you can see that our articles are partitioned between fossil fuels and nuclear and renewables and crypto and geopolitics, investments, metals, and the work of my life, and so on. And so it's all there. We're actually, tomorrow's piece is number 250, if you can believe that. So, and it's been a real blast to be here as always. Elijah, looking forward to the next time.
Sounds good, Doomberg. Thank you so much. Any last thoughts before we let you go?
No, just have a wonderful 2024 and then looking forward to a prosperous year.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and these are the Miles Franklin Weekly Specials for December 25th, 2023 through January 1st, 2024, while supplies last. First, we feature 1 10th-ounce gold maples at just $30 over melt with a minimum order of 5. Next, we have silver eagles at $4.99 over spot. making this a great time to swap silver bars into silver eagles at the lowest premium in years. Finally, constitutional 90% silver is just $3 over spot per ounce. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.